Between 1971 and 1983, Robert Hansen would abduct, rape, and murder at least 17 women in and around Anchorage, Alaska, until his eventual arrest in 1983. Hansen was connected to up to 21 murders, but some estimates would say he took the lives of 37 or more people. This is the story of the Butcher Baker of Alaska. Hi guys, and welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Blue, and I'm a police officer in Miami with over 10 years of experience. On this channel, we'll be reviewing crime cases, identifying failures in and around the justice system that allowed these monsters to stay free for so long. So if you like this kind of content, feel free to like and subscribe, as we'll be uploading every week here. Today's case takes us to Anchorage, Alaska, a remote area of the United States known for its natural beauty. However, blending in with the beautiful landscapes and hardworking people was a monster in the making. Join us as we investigate the case of Robert Hansen, also known as the Butcher Baker, as we attempt to answer our series' ultimate question: how did he get away with it for so long? As always, let's begin by learning the origins of our subject, Robert Hansen. This takes us far from Alaska, all the way to Estherville, Iowa. Robert Christian Hansen would be born on February 15, 1939, the oldest of two children. Hansen was raised by mother Edna Hansen and father Christian Hansen, who owned a bakery together. After moving around a bit, the Hansen family would eventually settle in Pocahontas, Iowa, in 1949. Reports from those who knew Hansen at this time would say he was incredibly shy, which was made worse by a stutter and severe acne, which would scar him for the rest of his life. Hansen would be described as quiet, often keeping to himself. Hansen would later describe his father as domineering, and his father would often insult him while he worked in the family bakery. Hansen would become an avid hunter, developing his skills in archery. He attended Pocahontas High School before graduating in 1957. Here, he would not have an easy time, and was the target for bullies, and reportedly was disliked by the girls. Afterwards, Hansen would enlist and serve in the United States Army Reserve for 1 year before being discharged, after which he worked for a short time as an assistant drill instructor in a police academy. While in this position, he would meet his first wife, Wilma McCord. Hansen and McCord would be married in the summer of 1960. There are very few pictures online of Wilma, and as such, I'll respect her privacy and refrain from showing her, as her name was also tough to find. Their marriage would not last long, as a troubling pattern would emerge from Hansen. On December 7, 1961, Hansen would be arrested for willfully and maliciously setting fire to and burning a motor vehicle from Pocahontas High School, in an apparent act of revenge for his unpopularity in those years. So early on, we see Hansen has an obvious anger issue, with deeply held feelings of resentment. This crime would ultimately result in him being sentenced to 3 years in prison, of which Hansen would actually only serve 23 months, finishing parole 1 year later. Another criminal released early. If you're a fan of that sort of thing, don't worry, because we have plenty more of it coming. While incarcerated, Hansen would be diagnosed with manic depressive disorder, alongside periodic schizophrenic episodes. It would be noted by his psychiatrist that Hansen was obsessed with getting back at people he felt had wronged him. Upon Hansen receiving his prison sentence, his wife would divorce him after only several short months of marriage. Hansen's life appears rough for the next few years after his release. He would reportedly go on to be arrested multiple times for petty crimes such as theft and fraud. Hansen showed a very strong and strange love for stealing, and would go on to state that whenever he stole, he would nearly have an orgasm once he left the store. None of these arrests would result in any long-term sentences, and it's likely Hansen spent minor, if any, amount of time in jail. The records here are few and far between, so we unfortunately don't know exactly how much, if any, jail time he would serve for these crimes. In my experience, persons committing minor offenses will often do no jail time at all. For instance, I personally know of a local vagrant that was arrested over a dozen times in a period of several weeks for trespassing and stealing from a local 7-Eleven. He would be released so quickly from jail that he was sometimes arrested twice in a 12-hour period, and this was without any money for a bond whatsoever. Our justice system simply doesn't care about minor offenders, and it's nearly impossible to make a difference in the quality of life for residents and businesses by removing repeat offenders, as our court system often waits for someone to get hurt before finally removing them from the community. During this period of committing all the petty crimes we previously mentioned, Hansen would be married a second time, to Darla Henriksen. Hansen and Darla would go on to have 2 children in the following years. In 1967, the two would relocate to Anchorage, Alaska, where in the years to follow, the terror would begin. While here, Hansen would be liked by his neighbors and was locally known as a hunter, eventually setting several records in his area. He would follow in his family's footsteps and open a bakery with his wife, becoming a well-known staple in the local community. But his new life was not enough to cause him to turn from his old ways. November 15, 1971. Hansen would encounter 18-year-old Susie Heppard. Hansen saw her at a stop sign and followed her home. As she exited her car, Hansen walked up to her, pointing a firearm at her back. He would threaten her, saying, "Shut up, sweetheart, or I'll blow your head off." But before he could abduct Susie, Susie's roommate saw this and called the police, causing Hansen to flee. He would be caught and charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Here's yet another example of the weakness of our court systems, and I can promise you it's not any better today. Hansen would be released on personal recognizance while he awaited trial. I'd like to make a note about this next victim. While researching this case, I did come across several inconsistencies as it relates to victim names and even photographs. For instance, in most sources, this next victim is named Barbara Fields. In the Wikipedia, she is simply listed as an unnamed prostitute. In likely the most authoritative source, a book titled Butcher, Baker, by authors Walter Gilmore and Leland E. Hale, names her as Patricia Ann Roberts, and this is also verified by a police record. To that end, we'll be referring to her as Patty Roberts. I just wanted to take a second and clear that up. Let's move on. December 19th, 1971. 6 days before Christmas, Hansen would abduct and sexually assault an 18-year-old Patricia Ann Roberts, known as Patty. After being sexually assaulted, Patty would beg Hansen for her life, promising she wouldn't tell anyone what he had done. Hansen agreed to let her go, but forced Patty to give him her parents' address. Hansen then told her he would kill her parents if she ever told the police. For a short while, Patty carried the burden of this secret alone, but after several days, a college freshman's body was found in a ravine close to where Patty had been assaulted. Convinced this was the work of Hansen, Patty spoke up and reported this to the police. This was exceptionally brave for an 18-year-old girl who was worried this could result in her parents' death. The investigative process used by police is unknown here, but somehow their investigation turned up Hansen as a suspect. Patty was able to identify Hansen as a photograph of her attacker, leading to Hansen's arrest. Now remember that Hansen is considered a well-known and well-liked member of the community. A proficient hunter who is married with children, he is not seen as the kind of person that polite society would see as a predator. Allegedly, Hansen knew certain influential members of the community that would pressure Patty to drop the charges. Today, we have laws in the books to prevent this. If a person does try to influence or convince a victim or witness of a crime to drop the charges, like we saw in our video on John Wayne Gacy, they themselves would be guilty of a third-degree felony. However, multiple sources say different things, so I will go forward with the most consistent version of the events. Both Patty and Susie would press charges. However, rumors would arise that claimed Patty was a drug addict and the assault was actually a dispute over payment, as she was accused of being a prostitute. If either was true, it is irrelevant to the charges, and Hansen would and should still be guilty of a crime. People addicted to drugs or engaged in prostitution can still themselves be victims of a crime, but in court these can be used to discredit a witness or a victim's position. It would seem that this ultimately worked, as a plea deal would be struck dropping any charges related to the crime against Patty, in exchange for 5 years imprisonment for the crimes against Susie. That's right, if you've been following along with all of my videos, you're probably seeing just how prevalent these plea deals are. And these are just famous cases. In my experience, most cases are either dropped entirely or pled out, referring to an agreed upon plea deal being made. In this case, Patty got no real justice. It's hard to think how many lives could have been saved if Hansen had been made to face justice for his crimes against Patty as well. Dr. Langdon would make the determination that Hansen was mentally ill and suffered from dissociative episodes causing him to commit these crimes. This was huge for his defense and resulted in him yet again receiving counseling and being sentenced to only 5 years. Hansen would work with counselors and Dr. Alan H. Parker for treatment while he was incarcerated. Hansen would be recommended for release after only 6 months and sent to a halfway home for 1 year, ultimately being released on parole, which would come to an end 3 years later. Dr. Parker was the one who made this recommendation for parole. This is likely the greatest failure of the justice system in this case. 3 of the 4 murders Hansen would later be convicted of were determined to have taken place during the period of time Hansen would have been locked up if the justice system had been operating in the interest of the people rather than a criminal. December 22nd, 1971. Celia Beth Van Zanten, 18 years old. On that cold December night, Celia was at home with 2 of her older brothers who she lived with. Celia's parents lived in another home in the area. She decided to walk to a nearby buy-low store at approximately 8:30 p.m. A neighbor would later claim to see her walking in the area around 9 p.m., but it is known that Celia never made it to the store. Sadly, she would go missing and not be reported for 2 days. The reasons for this aren't given, but perhaps it's like many others before her, who just have a habit of leaving for long periods at a time. Or maybe it's due to an odd family environment that doesn't find sudden absences too strange, or just delays reporting it in hopes that she'll turn up. No matter the cause, Celia would eventually be discovered on Christmas Day, 1971. She would be found in a deep ravine in a nearby state park, with a deep laceration to her chest, handcuffed and partially stripped. An autopsy would reveal that she had died due to exposure to the cold, but that she had tried with everything in her to escape. Evidence on the scene revealed she had tried to climb out of the ravine, but was unable to do so due to being bound. The area of her gravesite was marked on a flight map Hansen would later be found to have, which linked him to multiple murders. Hansen would never admit to killing her, but this apparently was common for him if the victim wasn't known to be a prostitute. Something to note here is this murder as well as the crime against Patty were done while Hansen was out on personal recognizance. July 7th, 1973. 17-year-old Megan Emmerich vanishes into thin air. She was last spotted leaving a dorm laundry room while attending a nearby boarding school. Megan's roommates found this suspicious, as none of her personal items had been taken. Her roommate conducted a 3-day search by herself before reporting her missing. Again, a huge delay before involving police. Hansen would deny killing her, but admitted to being in that area the day she vanished. A mark would also be shown to be on his flight map in that area. Allegedly, Hansen would admit to an inmate later on that he had taken Megan to his cabin by plane, where he killed her and buried her. July 5th, 1975. 22-year-old Mary Thill was last seen alive by a friend who drove her into town to a local bakery. She was seen by a different friend near a waterfall later that afternoon and would be reported missing by her husband later the same day. Hansen would be suspected due to a mark on his map in the area near the waterfall. He would once again, years later, admit to killing Mary and discarding of her body in the nearby Resurrection Bay to a fellow inmate. November 3rd, 1976. Hansen would be arrested after stealing a chainsaw from a local store. He pulled an old trick as he walked into the store with a receipt for a previously purchased chainsaw and walked out with a new one, pretending he had already paid for it. An eagle-eyed security guard saw this and stopped Hansen in the parking lot. Hansen would claim that he did this because several weeks prior, his father had been talking about wanting a new chainsaw. He stated that he just wanted to give his father the chainsaw before Christmas, before he passed away. At trial, the sentencing judge would note that this was Hansen's third felony arrest, and also noted all of his other misdemeanor arrests. This judge did his job well. Hansen could have, based on Alaska law, been charged with a misdemeanor. Due to Hansen's record, the judge upgraded the charge from theft to theft from a building, making it a felony in Alaska. This allowed the judge to sentence Hansen to up to 7 years in prison. Of this, he would be sentenced to 5. 5 years from the date of 1976. Keep those prison terms in mind as we move forward, as Hansen would also have been locked up during additional murders during this time period. Would have been, that is, if the Alaska Supreme Court had not stepped in upon receiving an appeal from Hansen. I'd really like to take some time on this and go through the case ruling with you all, to give you an understanding of how courts make these decisions, and what was considered in this case. So let's get into Hansen v. State. Chief Justice Bushever and Justices Rabinowitz, Connor, Burke, and Matthews would rule on this case. In these cases, the judges firstly review the facts of the case. Here, they note that Hansen entered a guilty plea to larceny in a building. Hansen is sentenced to 5 years. Hansen would be eligible for parole at the earliest possible date, but with the provision that he gets psychiatric therapy. Judges review the circumstances of the theft and Hansen's statement as to why he did it. So when judges weigh a sentence or a plea deal, they have to articulate why they believe this will serve the best interest of the public or the defendant. In the case they plan to hand out a light sentence, especially against recommended guidelines, this must be noted and explained. An important consideration to weigh when sentencing is one's financial status, work record, and if one is the sole provider for the family. In this case, Hansen does have steady income, a stable job, and he owns a home and 3 vehicles, all while supporting a wife and 2 children. For a defendant, these facts are a very good indication the judge will hand them a light sentence depending on their crime and their criminal history. However, the Supreme Court of Alaska also noted Hansen's criminal history, which we reviewed earlier. This is Hansen's 3rd felony conviction, and while it is his only felony theft charge, Hansen would tell doctors that he steals often and feels a compulsion to, being unable to resist it. Hansen is diagnosed again with bipolar affective disorder, noted by his periods of mania, which Dr. Robert McMahon claims are causing his crimes. The doctor also claims this illness caused Hansen to commit all of his other crimes, which in my opinion is irrelevant. No matter what causes one to commit crimes, dangerous individuals need to be removed from society and treated, especially one with uncontrollable urges. The court then recognized the advancements in treating bipolar disorders due to the drug lithium. I'd like to point out that Dr. McMahon would actually claim with Hansen being treated, it was preferable to have him remain an active member of society. Now, they didn't know what Hansen would go on to do, but they do have knowledge of what he has already done, and how dangerous he can be. Okay, let's get back to the case. The court then weighed 3 testimonies that the original judge also considered, that of Hansen's probation officer, Dr. McMahon's, and a pre-sentencing report. The probation officer would reason, wisely, that Hansen's mental state and prior offenses made him likely to reoffend if released on probation, and recommended a 5-year sentence with further treatment. The doctor and the pre-sentence report wished Hansen to be paroled immediately, with the provision that he would be forced to attend treatment while on lithium. The original sentencing judge would write a long opinion of the reasonings behind Hansen's original 5-year sentence, which I'll display on the screen here, and you can pause if you're interested in reading the entire thing. To wrap this up, Hansen would file an appeal on April 7, 1977, to be released on parole. This would be the Alaska Supreme Court's position. While we commend the sentencing judge for his thoughtful and extensive evaluation of the case, our independent examination of the record convinces us that the sentence imposed was excessive, and the case must be remanded for further sentencing proceedings. The court also outlined the Alaska Constitution's policy to be achieved in sentencing. Penal administration shall be based on the principle of reformation and upon the needs for protecting the public. You'll notice here that the principle of reforming comes before the protection of the public. This is fitting, as we see it time and time again, the needs of a criminal being put before the needs of victims. This is a common attitude in the entirety of law, despite what some may think. The judges would also cite this in their opinion. The American Bar Association has stated that in the vast majority of cases, prison sentences are significantly higher than are needed to adequately protect the interests of the public, and that, except for cases involving particularly serious offenses, dangerous offenders and professional criminals, maximum prison terms ought not to exceed 5 years. We agree. So, to summarize all of what I said, here's the ultimate conclusion of the court. We remand with directions that the Superior Court place Hansen on probation as expeditiously as possible. Reversed and remanded. All judges but one would concur. Justice Burke would be the only one to dissent, stating, "Given Hansen's prior record, I am unable to agree that the trial court erred in imposing a 5-year sentence." And with that, Hansen would be released into the world, once again a free man. July 21st, 1980. The remains of an unknown woman, normally referred to as a Jane Doe, were discovered buried in an area of woods in Eklutna, Alaska. She would become known as Eklutna Annie, and to this day remains Hansen's only unknown victim, despite extensive efforts from law enforcement. This includes DNA tests and numerous forensic facial reconstruction projects. With many of our victims, once they're identified, even if it's not for years later, detectives are often able to find the date of their last sighting, giving us a likely abduction or murder date. Since she tragically remains unidentified, all we know is she is likely killed several months prior to being discovered by workers. Annie was severely decomposed, but is described as white with possible Native American heritage, standing 4'11" to 5'3", with light brown to strawberry blonde hair. Here, I'll include several pictures of her based on those forensic reconstructions, just in the off chance she may be recognized. If you're wondering about how it could be so hard to identify Annie's family, let's talk about what was going on in Alaska at this time. Alaska's population was booming due to a massive construction project taking place on the Alaska Pipeline during these years. This led to a massive boost, with the population growing 30% from 1980 to 1985. That's the entire population of Alaska up 30% in 5 years. With the sudden addition of these jobs came a number of nightclubs and strip clubs that would open up. Some women who also worked as dancers would work as prostitutes on the side. Many of these women, however, were reported to run a route from California up the coast, ultimately spending time in Alaska before leaving again. Most of them were gone for months or years at a time, and it is not hard to imagine many may have not had close ties to their families. This is not to say that's who Annie was. Annie could have been literally anyone from anywhere in the world, but it is believed that she was not local to the area, or she likely would have been matched with a living relative after being reported missing. But to this day, police have not given up identifying Annie. While she may be unknown, justice would be served for Annie, as Hansen would admit to killing her sometime in 1979. Hansen claims she was a prostitute or a stripper, but does not remember her name. He claimed he picked her up, and after driving around for a while, holding her at gunpoint as she was threatening to jump out of her car. Hansen claimed he picked her up and drove her around for a little while holding her at gunpoint as she was threatening to jump out of the vehicle. Hansen stated he took her to an isolated area where his vehicle would become stuck in the mud. According to him, Annie actually helped him free his vehicle from the mud, but ran away from him when he got back in the car. He alleges that he tackled her to the ground, as Annie cried out, "Don't kill me, don't kill me." Cruel as he was, Hansen told her he wasn't going to hurt her, as he savagely stabbed her in the back with his knife. Annie holds the distinction as one of the 4 victims that ensured Hansen would remain in prison until he died. May 19th, 1980. 24-year-old Joanna Messina would go out to dinner with Hansen. Joanna was a dancer at a nearby club, and according to Hansen, the date was going well. Until, allegedly, Joanna offered to have sex with Hansen for money. He then drove Joanna and her dog to a secluded area near Snow River, before shooting her twice and her dog once with a .22 caliber revolver. Hansen reportedly shot Joanna's dog so it wouldn't lead people back to the body. He would then place her body in a nearby pit, covering her with loose gravel. Her dog and belongings were thrown in the nearby woods, and the firearm was thrown into the Snow River. Joanna would remain missing until her body was discovered on July 8, 1980, having been scavenged by local wildlife. June 28, 1980. 24-year-old Roxanne Eastland vanished after meeting with an unknown man in downtown Anchorage. Roxanne was reported missing by her boyfriend that night, but would remain missing until Hansen admitted to killing her after his final arrest. Despite this confession, Roxanne's body would never be found. September 6, 1980. 41-year-old Lisa Futrell meets Hansen at her job, a club called Bush Company in Anchorage. When she failed to return home the next day, her roommates would report her missing. No witnesses were able to identify who Lisa left the club with, and with no further leads, the case went cold. Lisa's body would eventually be discovered 4 years later on May 4, 1984, buried in a gravel pit. November 17, 1981. 23-year-old Sherry Morrow told her friends she was meeting up with a photographer after being offered $300 for nude photos. Sadly, Sherry would never return, and she would remain missing until her body was discovered in a shallow grave on September 12, 1982. An autopsy would find that Sherry had been shot 3 times in the back with .223 caliber rounds, and 3 of the same caliber shell casings were discovered alongside her body. It was also discovered that her clothing had no signs of bullet holes in them, meaning she was dressed after her murder. December 2, 1981. 24-year-old Andrea Fish Altieri would last be seen taking a taxi to a nearby mall in Anchorage. Andrea would get her Fish nickname from a unique fish necklace she wore. She told several friends and coworkers she was meeting a man to perform a photo shoot and dance for him. Andrea would never be seen again. After his arrest, Hansen claims that after meeting Andrea, he abducted her, handcuffing and blindfolding her before she was sexually assaulted. Hansen claims that he then shot her with a .22 caliber pistol, killing her. Andrea's body would be put into a duffel bag and loaded with gravel, ultimately being thrown in the Knik River. Her body has never been found. However, her unique fish necklace would later be recovered from Hansen's home, connecting him to the crime. May 26, 1982. 23-year-old Sue Luna would meet Hansen while dancing in a nightclub. Hansen offered her $300 for a photo shoot, which she agreed to. Sue would be reported missing the following day. Hansen would later admit to abducting her after the first meeting and releasing her into an isolated forest, hunting her down and shooting her like an animal. While she was fleeing from Hansen, he stripped her totally nude so that if she did manage to evade him, the elements would kill her. April 24th, 1984. The badly decomposing remains of 19-year-old Robin Pelkey were discovered buried near Horseshoe Lake in Palmer, Alaska. Autopsy reveals that she had been stabbed and shot, but she would remain unknown for decades. Fortunately, investigators never gave up in identifying her, and on October 22, 2021, Robin would be identified using forensic genealogy. Once investigators had this information, they were able to identify her as a woman who had vanished on July 19, 1983. August 20, 1985. The body of a 22-year-old waitress and Anchorage resident, Delynn Renee Free, was discovered on a sandbar by a pilot who was flying in the area. Delynn was last seen sometime in March of 1983, but was sadly not immediately reported missing. She would be buried as an unknown missing person, labeled as a Jane Doe. In 1989, an Alaska state trooper would review her file and recognize jewelry found on her as the same jewelry reported missing in another missing persons case, finally revealing her name. April 25, 1983. 30-year-old Paula Goulding met Hansen after he offered to pay her for sex. Hansen would abduct her once she was in the car and take her to a remote spot via plane. Once there, Hansen claims Paula fled from him, and as a result, he shot her in the back one time with a .223 round, killing her. Paula's body was discovered buried along the Kinnick River, and again it was noted that Paula's clothing did not have a tear in it, telling investigators that she was naked when she was killed, but dressed before she was buried. July 10, 1981. 28-year-old dancer Malai Larson would be reported missing from Anchorage. Her case would remain unsolved until Hansen led authorities to her body on April 24, 1984, in a parking lot. March 25, 1983. 22-year-old dancer Teresa Watson would be reported missing by her roommate after telling her she was meeting a man who offered her $300 for sex. Hansen would later confess to her slaying, telling detectives he kidnapped her after meeting at Scenic Lake. However, Hansen cruelly left her body lying on the ground, exposing her to the animals and elements, as the ground was frozen and he could not dig it up. Teresa would be discovered on May 17, 1984. February of 1973. The last known time 24-year-old Angela Federn was seen. With no family and friends in regular contact with her, Angela would be reported missing by the manager of the nightclub she worked at. She would be like many of Hansen's victims, remaining undiscovered until he led investigators to her body on April 26, 1984. Her body was so frozen into the ground that her jawbone would have to be removed and transported back to a lab separately to identify her. August 7, 1982. 20-year-old Tamara Peterson, a dancer at a nightclub, would speak to her family for the last time, unbeknownst to any of them. The last thing her family hears is that Tamara was offered an unspecified amount of money to pose for photographs. Hansen again would admit to killing her after his arrest, and this would be the final body Hansen led police to, being discovered near Old Kinnick Bridge on April 29, 1984. June 13, 1983. Let's end with the victim who would escape Hansen and bring all his crimes to light. 17-year-old Cindy Paulson would be approached by Hansen and offered $200 to perform oral sex. Despite her age, Cindy was a working prostitute and accepted Hansen's offer. After getting in his car, he would hold her at gunpoint, abducting her and taking her to his home. Here, Cindy was held captive and repeatedly sexually assaulted. Cindy would claim that afterwards, Hansen chained her around the neck and took a nap on a nearby couch. After the nap, he took Cindy to his car, claiming he was taking her to his cabin. The cabin would only be accessible by plane or boat. Cindy, knowing her life was on the line, made her escape while Hansen was loading supplies into his plane. While his back was turned, Cindy would flee on foot. Hansen would give chase, but was unable to stop her from flagging down a nearby truck. Thankfully, the truck driver would pick her up and flee the area, taking her to the Mush Inn and calling the police. Officers from the Anchorage Police Department would arrive and be told that Cindy had taken a cab to the nearby Big Timber Hotel, where Cindy's boyfriend worked. Officers then responded there and met with a still handcuffed and barefoot Cindy. Cindy would be taken back to the station, where she would give a statement and description of Hansen. Cindy gave a detailed description of Hansen, being a slim man with an acne-marked face and black-rimmed glasses. She was able to give a general area of his home, including a description of the vehicle in the driveway and a notable feature of his house, moose or deer antlers up on the roof. Cindy also gave a great description of the inside of his home, describing the numerous hunting trophies on the walls, and a pole in the center of the room which she had been chained to. Horrifyingly enough, Cindy would claim that Hansen told her he had taken about 7 other women to his cabin, and that he normally keeps them there for about a week. This, in retrospect, is a really terrifying detail. Most of the other killers we cover are assaulted or held for a matter of several hours, and rarely a day or so. But learning that Hansen's victims seem to have been tormented by him for up to a week, all alone in the wilderness, is just tragic and heartbreaking. After giving her statement, Cindy was taken home while detectives began to investigate. While there, Cindy insisted that the officers take her to a nearby airfield where Hansen's plane was. I'd like to note just how unusual this is, for this reason. When you have a case like this, one of the very first things you do, after getting a detailed description of the incident from the victim, is to locate the exact crime scene, especially where they escaped from. It seems almost like Cindy had to convince officers to take her to the scene of her escape, which if true, is a shocking mistake in their police work. Thankfully, they listened, and Cindy would identify the plane she had seen Hansen with. A quick check of the registration showed that it came back to Robert Hansen. This came as a shock to Anchorage police, as Hansen was very well known in the community, and many officers were frequent customers of his bakery. This is another underlying issue with cases like this. Police are humans too, and when we think we know someone well, we too can be instantly doubtful of any accusation against them, even if there's some evidence to support the claim. This is not an excuse by any means, just an observation and acknowledgement of the failures of police in this case, which is a big part of what we discuss here. Now, detectives would correctly immediately follow up with this information and respond to Hansen's home to interview him. Upon their arrival, they noticed Hansen, his home, and his cars all match the description given by Cindy. This at least proves that Cindy knows him and has been to his house. Hansen continued to act as the community knew him, polite and cooperative to police. Hansen admitted that he knew the girl and had paid her for sex previously, but that she was trying to extort him. Hansen would say, besides, how can you rape a prostitute anyway? This shows us that Hansen truly viewed these women as property and subhuman. Hansen would convince several friends to falsely give him an alibi by claiming he had been visiting them the night of the attack. Hansen would even allow officers inside, where no physical evidence would be found. According to one officer on scene, the lead investigator would actually believe Hansen, that Cindy had raised the price of sex and tried to extort him. The officer on scene, Baker, however, would have strong doubts. Eventually, this case would be suspended, meaning that while it was still open, it was no longer being actively investigated unless more substantial leads came up. This was due to several factors, so let's list them quickly. Number 1, conflicting statements, and no evidence that points towards one person over another. So essentially, this case was a he said, she said deal, where both versions of the events could have been true. If Hansen had denied meeting Cindy, then they likely would have been able to arrest him, as he would have not been able to explain how she had known so much about him, to include the interior of his home. Number 2, Hansen had a solid alibi with at least 2 other people for the entire night that Cindy claimed to be abducted. These would later turn out to be fake, but at the time, officers believed they were valid and had no authority to do anything otherwise about it. And number 3, Cindy would disappear and fall out of contact with investigators several times. This could have been due to many reasons, but it is difficult to investigate a case when it seems like the victim has moved or cannot be reached. Cindy also refused to take a polygraph test, but I am unsure if Hansen was ever asked to take one, and if not, why not? Number 4, finally, these cases are difficult to prove. You cannot just arrest someone for a crime without probable cause, because that would be a violation of their rights. You must be able to show probable cause before you bring the case to a state attorney. In this case, officers just did not have enough to charge Hansen. However, had a good background check been done, Hansen would likely have become a suspect sooner than he was. Now we've talked about all the failings of the courts and police up to this point. Let's take a break and recognize some actual good police work. Baker had a hunch that Cindy was telling the truth, and that there was more to Hansen than anyone suspected. This was due to the number of women who were being discovered murdered in recent years, and the dozen or more that had gone missing in the same time period. Baker, despite the case being suspended, worked on that hunch, doing a very thorough background on Hansen, and discovering his lengthy criminal record, including his crimes against young women like Cindy. Baker knew that not only was he not supposed to be investigating this case, but also that he would not receive the support he needed in this department, as many officers had blinders on to what Hansen really was. Baker takes the case to the Alaska State Troopers and meets with Trooper Wayne Van Clausen. Clausen reviewed the files and is convinced, along with Baker, that Hansen is their prime suspect in the numerous slayings and disappearances in the area. However, both Clausen and Baker know neither department has the resources to handle this, so they contact the FBI, who creates a suspect profile of the killer. This profile is insanely accurate, describing their killers as someone who likely has a stutter or some other speech impediment. It also specifies that the killer has low self-esteem, faced rejection from women, and is a proficient hunter. This was an absolutely massive win for the case against Hansen. Cindy's allegations, the profile, and Hansen's own criminal history would finally give police what they needed to file for a search warrant of Hansen's home. October 27, 1983. A search warrant was served on Hansen's home, car, and plane. Discovered in the home were jewelry belonging to some of the victims, and most damning of all was a flight map hidden away behind Hansen's headboard. This map had 37 X marks on it in various locations. These marks corresponded to where victims had already been discovered, and would later reveal numerous other grave sites. It was then that investigators realized just how many lives Hansen had taken. Hansen's friends, at the news of his arrest, would finally recant and admit their alibis were faked. Hansen would deny the allegations and refuse to admit to the murders, but would eventually realize just how much evidence was against him. Finally, Hansen would be held to account for all the lives he had taken. Finally, he would no longer be freed by a weak justice system, and finally, people would be safe, at least from him. There would be enough evidence to link Hansen to the murders of up to 21 women, but the X's on his map would indicate the number was likely 24. However, Hansen eventually took them to the grave of Robin Pelkey, who was not marked on the map at all. Because of this, there is no way to know for certain how many victims Hansen actually had. So let's go through the trial quickly. Hansen would be conclusively linked to several murders by a ballistics comparison of his rifle and shell casings left at the scene. Because of this, Hansen would enter, are you ready for this? A plea deal. At least this one didn't include a chance for him to be free again. The plea deal required Hansen to plead guilty to 4 murders, those of Morrow, Messina, Golding, and Annie. In addition, Hansen was required to help investigators decipher his flight map and to lead detectives to as many grave sites as possible to bring closure to the victims' families. Hansen led detectives to 17 grave sites, 12 of which were not known by authorities. Despite this, Hansen still refused to admit to the murders of several women, such as Mary Thill and Megan Emmerich, but as stated before, he would eventually admit to these killings to other prisoners. Hansen would be sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. This case was also kept largely out of the media, with little coverage at the time, at least nothing like we saw for Bundy or Gacy. This was apparently part of Hansen's plea deal. While justice was eventually served, Hansen would live to the ripe old age of 75 on August 21st, 2014, when he would die due to natural causes. And that's it, really. This was an exhausting case to research, and I'm sorry for the delay in uploading to you guys, as I'm doing my best to bring you all a new case every week. Unfortunately, some technical difficulties resulted in me having to start this all over halfway through my project. This one is a tragic study, just as all the other ones have been, yet here I think the most mistakes were made that allowed Hansen to stay free for as long as he did. It's not just a single judge or cop making an error here. It almost feels like the entire justice system did everything in its power to ensure this monster stayed free, no matter what the crime. As I stated earlier, this case was largely kept out of the media and had certain conflicting information based on the sources, so I apologize for any inaccuracies that there may be. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, as well as that segment reviewing the Supreme Court's case ruling. We'll be back to uploading weekly, so if you guys have any suggestions or cases you'd like my input on, leave them in the comments. And as always, stay safe and stay tuned.